Hey everyone. Today, we're diving into a compound you've almost certainly heard of, even if you don't know its full technical name, Delta-9 THC. We're going to break down what it is, what it does, and how to think about it in a really clear way.
So, you've definitely heard of THC, right? It's the most famous part of the cannabis plant. But here's the thing. When most people say THC, what they're really talking about is this one specific molecule, Delta-9. It's the most common form, and it's the one that's responsible for, well, most of the effects people associate with cannabis.
All right, so let's start at square one. Let's build that foundation. What exactly is this stuff?
At its heart, Delta-9 is what's called a cannabinoid. You can think of cannabinoids as the special active ingredients inside the cannabis plant. And Delta-9, it's the star of the show. It is the main psychoactive component, which is just a sciencey way of saying it's the primary reason for the high.
So how does it actually work? Well, when Delta-9 gets into your system, it has a direct line to your brain. It basically flips a switch that tells your brain to release dopamine. And as you probably know, dopamine is our natural feel-good chemical. It's the same thing that lights up when we experience pleasure and reward. Okay, now this is where the conversation gets a little more nuanced, because the effects of Delta-9 are kind of like a double-edged sword. There's a potential upside, but there's also a downside, and it's really important to understand both. So you really have two sides of the same coin. You've got these potential benefits that people are talking about and that science is looking into, but then you also have some very common side effects. The big thing to remember, though, is that most of those side effects are temporary. They fade as the high wears off. Getting this balance is key. So on the positive side, people often report short-term effects like feeling more relaxed or even having an increased sense of focus. And from a medical standpoint, researchers are looking at its potential for a whole host of things, from helping with chronic pain and anxiety to easing nausea for patients undergoing chemotherapy. But on the flip side, you have the common side effects that are probably pretty familiar, like anxiety, dry mouth, maybe some short-term memory blips, and definitely slower reaction times. Again, the important thing here is that for most people, these things are temporary. They go away once the effects subside.
So those are the short-term things. But what about the more serious risks? This is where we need to be really careful and aware, especially when we're talking about long-term or heavy use. There are really three big areas of concern. First, how you use it really matters. Smoking or vaping can definitely irritate your lungs. Second, and this is a big one, for younger people, there's solid evidence linking cannabis use in teens to changes in brain development. And finally, yeah, dependence is a real possibility, and with it can come withdrawal symptoms if you stop using it regularly. And here's a number that should really make you stop and think. A huge review back in 2020 found that about 22%, that's more than 1 out of every 5 people who use cannabis, may end up developing cannabis use disorder. That is not a small number, and it points to a very serious risk.
Okay, so with all that on the table, let's get practical. If someone is thinking about using Delta-9 products, how can they approach it in the safest way possible?
Here are 4 super clear, actionable steps that come straight from the experts. First, and this is crucial, start low and go slow. A tiny 1 or 2 milligram dose is a great place to begin. Second, since these products aren't really regulated by the federal government, you have to do your homework. Look for brands that are upfront and provide testing results from a third-party lab. Third, to skip the lung irritation, think about other options like edibles or tinctures. And finally, and please remember this, if you do go with edibles, you have to be patient. They can take a lot longer to kick in than you might think.
You know, the best piece of advice really boils down to this. To avoid an unpleasant experience, pace yourself. Remember that the effects are temporary. Pacing yourself is everything, and just reminding yourself that if you do feel overwhelmed, that feeling will pass.
All right, to wrap things up, let's zoom out and put Delta-9 into the bigger picture. The market is just full of confusing terms right now, so let's clear up a couple of the most common questions people have. This is a big one. You see Delta-8 everywhere these days. Is it just another name for Delta-9? The short answer, no, not at all.
They might have a similar name and chemical structure, but they are not the same. Delta-9 is much more potent, and it's found naturally in large amounts in the plant. Delta-8, on the other hand, is less potent, and it often has to be made synthetically, which can bring up a whole other set of safety questions.
Okay, next question. What about the other superstar of the cannabis plant, CBD? Where does that fit into all this? Here's the simplest, most important way to remember the difference. Delta-9 is intoxicating. It gives you a high. CBD is non-intoxicating. It has its own set of potential therapeutic effects, for sure, but it is not going to give you that same psychoactive experience. Period. And that brings us to the final million-dollar question that's on everybody's mind. Is any of this actually legal?
And the answer is, well, it's really complicated. On a federal level here in the US, no, it's not legal. But when you look at the states, it's a completely different story. It's a total patchwork of laws all across the country. Some states allow it for medical use, some for recreational use, and some have banned it completely.
So here's the bottom line. Delta-9 is the classic, most studied version of THC. It comes with a whole range of potential benefits that science is actively exploring, but it absolutely, 100% requires you to be cautious, to be self-aware, and to understand all the risks involved. And that really leaves us with one final thought to take away. We're in a world where the science around this is changing all the time, and the laws are constantly shifting. So the power to stay informed really is in your hands. The real question is, how will you make sure that the choices you make are not just informed, but also safe?